God of War Ragnarok will soon give us the epic showdown to end all showdowns as the gods of Norse myth finally face their final battle, while Kratos, at the same time, navigates his way through the action. And one of the major players in Norse mythology and Ragnarok itself will also end up as Kratos' main antagonist, the god of thunder himself, Thor. So let's become the gods of lore as we take a look at how Thor initially appeared in Norse mythology, discuss how that compares to what we already know about the thunder god in the game, and what that might mean for his ultimate fate as the end times, Ragnarok itself, thunders closer. When we think of Thor today, we tend to envision the Marvel version of the character. Young, incredibly charismatic, honorable, noble, chiseled abs, and bearing the face of arguably the best of all the Hollywood Chris's.
The brain is a muscle, and that's a muscle, and that's a muscle, and they are all muscles, this is all muscle, so I am covered in brains, and I have more brains than you.
This is why many people seemed surprised when Thor showed up in the God of War Ragnarok promotional material looking like this. A vastly different depiction than what we're used to, but actually, this appearance and demeanor are much more in line with Norse myth than the Marvel version of the character is. In legend, Thor is known as the strongest warrior of the Aesir, the Norse gods, and he's unrivaled in strength and power. Today, though, we equate strength and power, especially for men, with zero body fat and a toned body. But this isn't the only way to be fit, nor was that body type the expectation of a fit person when Scandinavians worshipped Thor. Instead, having a stout body was actually considered a way to showcase that you had won many battles, and were thus able to feed yourself by celebrating your victories with food, drink, and song incredibly liberally. And indeed, this is something mythological Thor did a ton of, with endless stories of him loving to celebrate, even having been described as eating a whole ox, 8 salmon, and 3 whole gallons of mead in a single sitting. Many stories in Norse myth revolve around Thor just wanting to go out and get drunk. One story even involves Thor going all the way out of his way to find an excellent cauldron to brew ale in for a feast of the gods, traveling all the way far east and causing trouble with other gods along the way to secure the kettle. So, right away, God of War Ragnarok accurately depicts Thor as it aligns with Norse mythology. Yet, here is where God of War's depiction of the thunder god begins to differ from Norse myth. While in Norse mythology, Thor is undoubtedly an imperfect hero, often being short-tempered, easily enraged, and even somewhat racist towards giants and dwarves, he's generally an honorable warrior, an ideal to be aspired to, often defending the honor of those around him. In one tale, Thor arrived at a feast to find the visiting giant Hrungnir drunk and boasting about how he could kill all the other gods, including Freya and Sif, Thor's wife. Thor, angry at Hrungnir for dishonoring his family, lifted his hammer, Mjolnir, in order to kill Hrungnir right there. But the giant stopped him by accusing Thor of cowardice for attempting to murder an unarmed man and challenged him instead to a duel. Thor accepted the challenge, and the next day eventually killed Hrungnir in the duel by hitting his head with his hammer so hard that his head split open. But, at the same time, the giant managed to permanently lodge a piece of his whetstone in Thor's head for his troubles. So all in all, an honorable duel, at least by Aesir standards. Yet, in God of War 2018, this story is revealed to have been a fabrication, a story told to make Thor seem better than he actually was.
I saw the Aesir laugh as Hrungnir leapt upon his shield and swore he'd kill us all and take our womenfolk back to Jotunheim. Then Thor shows up. And does he laugh? Oh no. Thor takes one look at the drunken stone buffoon and brings down Mjolnir on his head so hard that he's got chunks of Hrungnir in his own skull to this day. Thor is so startled by the faceful of rock, he doesn't notice Hrungnir's body topple right onto him with a sickening crunch. And again, the roars of laughter echo through the palace halls.
That's an awful story, Mimir. Nothing like the ones Mother told me.
Let that be a lesson, my son. Truth is seldom so pretty as myth and legend.
This version of the tale, told by Mimir in the game, reveals that Thor just showed up and felt slighted by Hrungnir jokingly telling stories about him, and killed him out of his disgraced honor, all while the gods laughed as they watched on as a man died, uncaring either way. This less honorable version of Thor stands in sharp contrast to the Thor of myth. To the Scandinavian Vikings, Thor was the god of the people. Gods like Odin were the elites, worthy of worship, but consistently above others, wielding magic and other powers that an average person could never touch. In comparison, while certainly stronger than an average human, Thor's power came simply from his strength, something that any human could have and was an attribute that many in Viking society valued. Thor was relatable, a hero who you could quite literally have a beer with. This is not so much true for the Thor in God of War. While we never actually meet Thor in God of War 2018, we do see his effects on the lives of people that he's encountered. In one side quest, you encounter the spirit of a man whose family worshipped Thor.
After my father passed, my mother built the statue to watch over his grave. Imagine our surprise when the god of thunder himself came to offer condolences. At first we were thrilled, but he quickly took advantage of our hospitality. My mother begged him to leave, and Thor, in his drunken rage, killed her. I was left with nothing but grief. Eventually I lost that as well, and found only rage in its place.
Here we can see that the Thor of God of War takes what he wants, when he wants it, regardless of the consequences to anybody else, even to those who worship him. As Kratos himself says of this story,
Father, why did the gods cause so much trouble for us?
Because that is their nature.
this is perhaps the most significant departure between Norse myth and God of War's depiction of Thor. Where Thor in mythology was relatable compared to Odin, for example, both Thor and Odin in the game are the elites, who care nothing for the mortal lives beneath them. Yet this depiction actually fits in with the repeated theme of the entire God of War franchise. From the first game in the series, it has repeatedly been shown that the gods, whether they be Norse or Greek, care not for the lives of mortal men.
The gods of Olympus have abandoned me.
In the original trilogy on the PlayStation 2 and PlayStation 3, Kratos is used as a pawn in the Greek gods' machinations, who don't really care for him as a person, even going so far as to bind him to their service by tricking him into killing his family. After learning of this, Kratos became fueled and blinded by rage, and Kratos eventually murders the entire Greek pantheon in his quest for vengeance. By the time of God of War 2018, though, Kratos has managed to temper this rage through his family. But he recognizes the same uncaring attitude in the Norse gods that he saw in the Greek ones, as well as the lies that these gods tell mortals to uphold the mythos around them, a lesson he tries to pass on to his son, Atreus.
With all that power, you would think at least some of them would try to make life better for people.
And yet, the gods continue to spread misery. This is life, boy.
So this depiction of Thor in God of War, despite not being completely aligned with how Scandinavians viewed Thor in myth, fits perfectly within God of War's themes, and uses Norse mythology as evidence within the story to affirm this depiction of the gods' lies.
I always knew Odin was bad. But that's just...
Ruthless, barbaric, heartless? That's Odin. In fact, we would do well to sit here in silence for the next few moments and reflect on Odin's capacity for cruelty.
Yet, Thor in the games also reflects another theme: how those in power, like the gods, will do anything to hold on to that power. In the backstory to God of War 2018, Thor learns of the upcoming events of the world's end, Ragnarok, where he is fated to die in a battle with the world serpent Jormungand. Paranoid, Thor has the dwarves Brock and Sindri make his hammer Mjolnir so that he might use it in order to stop the events from coming to pass. He also makes his children soldiers focused only on preventing Ragnarok, and even attempts to steal the giants' ability to see the future from the Jotun, the giants, who manage to stop his attempts. Upset by this failure, Thor turns his anger towards the Jotun, killing many in his path. However, this bloodlust eventually leads to Thor's downfall, as he is eventually stopped by Jormungand itself, causing the very rivalry that would eventually lead to their final fight at the end of the world in Ragnarok. By attempting to stop Ragnarok, Thor slowly began to cause it. Much of this story rhymes with Norse legend, but it is distinctly different from it. For one, Thor's hammer Mjolnir is made by Brock and Sindri in myth, but more due to a playful bet by Loki, a story I discussed in a separate video on the mythology behind Loki in this series. But moving on, the Thor of legend also had a similar rivalry with Jormungand, who in this version is Loki's child, but it's more a battle of equals, not one of grudging hate. Many gods even attempt to stop Thor and Jormungand from facing each other in order to avoid Ragnarok, such as when the god Hymir cuts a fishing line in order to prevent Thor from catching the serpent. However, while the gods indeed fear and wish to prevent Ragnarok in myth, it is something that is often avoided rather than something actively attempted to be stopped, as we see in God of War. Yet, this is ultimately the story that God of War as a series has always been about. The uncaring drive of those in power towards those they control, and their unending willingness to hold onto that power at the expense of all others, even themselves. It speaks perhaps to the two distinct eras in which these stories are told. Vikings of old prided individual achievement, with fame and honor being considered the only things that carried on after you died, earning yourself a place in the annals of history by your glorious deeds and heroism, ideals that the Thor of myth reflected. Today, however, much of our cultural conversation centers upon issues of power, who deserves it, and should anyone even have it in the first place. We today are much more likely to distrust someone who seeks power for its own sake, and seems uncaring for the collective good. So using Thor as a critique as a symbol of this class discussion modernizes the context of this character and also makes him fit within the ideas that God of War Ragnarok and the franchise as a whole has always attempted to tackle head on. Or heads off, depending on what Kratos does to you. But with all that said, this is where we leave Thor for now. But if you want to learn more about Norse mythology and how it may tie into God of War Ragnarok, don't forget to subscribe to this channel, as we'll have another God of War video next week, and in the meantime, check out all of our coverage on God of War Ragnarok right here on GameSpot.